Lots of students, right? Well, that's tough. Because obviously IELTS is not designed for school children, but that's absolutely prepared. So, dear students, welcome to our IELTS level training session. On behalf of the Ladies and Summer Academy, our strategic partner, next up, we welcome you to the level training program, the British Council IELTS by 2024. And just a couple words about that. The extensions, years for context. This is not truly our first of all because he's from Canada. Second, this isn't 2018 when we start IELTS for first time. So, traditional event when top class experts like Harry Hugo or his colleagues from the experience about science, about language learning and teaching. For us, learning language is more about just engagement with our colleagues, friends, and also it is for young people feeling that you are in the same part with your counterparts everywhere in the world, whether it's next and learn English, which now become so and say community lingua franca for all of you in the world. All global problems that for as I say, it is more just about but one of the main indicators of learning language, of course, standard practice. So today, and we'll all mix and wedges about we did not implement computer and other lot of second during the next step, during examinations and beyond. Now I'd like to give her to making his presentation titled
Can you structure the interview as a speaking assessment? And yeah, please.
Here we are.
Just a couple of questions. Oops. Is there anything go to?
No?
I'll try to be careful. All right, so a couple of questions. Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear me? Do you understand what I'm saying? The question is, do they understand this? So I'm not just speaking in English, and if people don't understand the language, then it's difficult.
Can everyone understand English? Put your hands up if you understand English.
We'll see. We'll see. Because that's the story I'm going to tell you. It's complex. It's not an easy thing to talk about. So you will require some English. When we talk about assessing speaking, and we're going to talk about IELTS primarily today. The question which I want you to think about first is think about this question. So what is speaking a speaking test for you? What does it look like? What is it similar to? So do you think that it's maybe just a kind of a maybe it's a ticket to another country? So all we need is just a certain band, and that's it. That's the end of it. Maybe you see that going and taking IELTS and getting a good mark as a victory. Sports, you think, I have worked hard, now I have to achieve something. To achieve a victory, win the game, and you think, well done. Or maybe just you're not interested in IELTS at all. It's your parents who want you to study at university, and they push you. Or it's a boss who said, okay, you have to go and take IELTS. And say, okay, I will go and take IELTS. And all I want personally is to play a computer game, but I will have to take IELTS. Or maybe it's kind of a game or a gamble or a lottery. You think maybe this time I'm lucky, I'll get a good question and answer better than I did last time. So maybe next time is going to be my luck, and that's going to be something which I can be proud of. So maybe people think that it's just a game. Or sometimes, of course, you say that it's a police interrogation. You are kind of taken to a place where you have an examiner sitting, looking at you, asking questions, and you think, whatever is going on, they're going to ask me a lot of questions that should really sort of resist, or should I see the examiner as an enemy or kind? You can also think about IELTS test as a medical test. Let's go, we give you liquids, and then the doctor tells you how much sugar you have, how much different kind of cells you have in your blood, and so on. The PCR test. Or you think that if you've been working very hard, very often you hear students saying, well, I'm studying hard, I know I don't have any time to do anything You don't meet friends. You just study. And you think, okay, if I study long enough, I will get the results. And that is my payment for my effort. And then you can also think that maybe a speaking test is a way to impress an examiner. Just go and think, okay, what I'm going to wear, how I'm going to behave, to charm the examiner. That he would be much more lenient and kind to get a good result. So think about that, and we will go back to the issue then in this presentation. So what is a speaking test to you? We're going to be talking mostly about problems today, and my question is, who is to blame for some of the problems? So I will give you some examples of a problem, and you think, and I want you to tell me who you think is to be blamed for this problem. Whose problem is this? Is it parents or teachers or candidates or students themselves? So what happens if, for example, you have an IELTS candidate who calls his mother he and says things like he have, she have? Whose problem is this?
The students,
Why?
because the normal teacher teaches how to pronounce it correctly, right? And if the student is not able to do it correctly, that's the blame of the student.
So here we have a typical situation where obviously you've got the textbooks, you've got teachers who never teach you this, but if students continue doing this, that means that they are not good enough. They are not, they haven't reached that level of English. What happens when a student decides that they want to speak very fast, really fast and very loud? Whose problem is this? Why? What do you think might be the reason why students want to do that? Want to speak like this all the time? Why?
Maybe he or she wants to impress the examiner
With what?
with his speed of speech.
Could be the case. So we can say that the student may think that that's fluency. If you speak really fast, loud, you get a very good mark because that's it's well, that's not. But that's a problem of students. But then it could also be a bit of a blame to be made on the tutor. Because the tutor, the teacher, may sort of work with the student in such a way that to make them speak really fast. So then again, you have to speak fast. You have to speak fast. That's good. Student just says, and like for example, question like, "What's your favorite color?" And the student well, would you like to travel abroad? I never thought about it. What do you think happens here? Whose problem is this? Why is this a problem? Yeah. So the problem is that if IELTS, for example, or any speaking test is not a test of knowledge. It requires some kind of background knowledge, but it's not about knowledge. It's not about knowing things. It's about thinking and having thinking. If you study English, and I'm just saying the real situation where you get a student who studied English, and then you ask them, would you like to travel abroad? They say, I never thought about it. You don't study a foreign language, you're taking an exam. You never thought about whether you want to travel abroad or not. It's something really strange. But that happens very often. And people don't understand that, okay, if I ask a question, then there is a chance to think about this now. You may not have thought about your favorite car, but now you have an opportunity to think about it. But when people say, I never thought about it, it's kind of a disaster. It's the wrong strategy. And it's better to say something in this case than to say. What happens when students come for an interview late and they don't bring their passport? Whose problem is this? Students and teachers. Why teachers? Why do you think teachers can also be blamed for that? If students come late for an exam. No. Yeah, so the idea is, of course, that when you go to an IELTS course, it's not just about language. It is, of course, about the format of the exam. So you really need to know when to come, what you can do, what you can't do, and obviously the whole idea of registering for an exam is an important part of the exam. So somebody should tell you about that. And that's usually tutor. Tutor should do that. Also, what happens, of course, when students get a letter of invitation, it's written in English. And very often, low-level students simply can't read the invitation. They say, okay, that's the date, they come. But it also says, come 30 minutes before the exam, bring your passport, and so on. So, do you know this expression? A knee high to a grasshopper. Have you heard it? Yes. That's why do you think this is a kind of a problem? When people say, when I was knee high to a grasshopper, I used to do this. Understand why this is a problem? No. But you understand what it means. And it means small. Knee high to a grasshopper, you have a grasshopper, and grasshoppers have knees, and it's very small. So maybe it's a joke. I think it was invented some time ago and used somewhere. And as a joke, it's good only when it's used once. But the problem is that teachers often teach such language to students. Because, for example, in IELTS, you have this requirement to use phrasal verbs and idiomatic language, and people learn that. So instead of saying, when I was young, I liked to play volleyball, so when I was really actually a grasshopper, or people are taught to say something like, I've got some other fish to fry, so I'm busy now. Or they say, it's not my cup of tea, so I'm saying it's not my business. So that kind of language is taught, but it's not the language you speak normally. Your peers. So it's a bit artificial, or it can be very artificial. And it's very often the problem of the tutor. The tutor tells you to do that, to study all these things. Very often you have candidates who say, whatever you ask them, what do you think about is tourism in your country developing, or is the weather good? They say, yeah, our government is very good. It's working very hard to improve our tourism, to improve our climate, to improve our water, to improve our sports, and they thank the government for everything. And I think it comes from maybe from the school. In the school, there is a kind of this pressure to be loyal to the government, but it's not part of IELTS. You don't do it. It's not necessary. When people come and they sort of visibly shake and they tremble and they say, "Oh, I'm very nervous, very nervous." What do you think is happening? You understand? What happens when people come, they're trembling, they give you passport and What is this about? Why is this happening?
Maybe because they're not confident.
They're not confident. They're not confident. Yes, if you're not confident, you think, oh, I might fail, something like that. Then you obviously, if you're afraid, you fear, you tremble, you shake, all these things happen. And who is to be blamed for that? That's
It's not all the confidence side. It's sometimes people side who is that such emotions.
yes, yes, yes. No, yeah, that's true. I mean, some
For
people.
the first time.
The first time, exactly. But in general, you see the situation as, especially when it's younger people, they're afraid, they think it's a dangerous situation, they're not comfortable, they're not confident, and there is something wrong about it, something fundamentally wrong. And I would say that that's, again, the whole system. Because the system makes you believe that you have to go and win. You have to go and die. This exam is your last chance. So exam is not. Exam is just a way of knowing your level of English. It's not a death and life game. Death. It's not, end of the world. And people feel that sort of lack of confidence because they're not ready very often. They're not ready, and they know it. And then they shouldn't take it back. What happens when in IELTS students get upset when they're stopped? And there's a lot of stopping in IELTS. You know? Think about that. There's a lot of stopping. The exam says, okay, thank you, it's enough. And when the students get upset, that means, of course, they don't know the format. So they think, okay, I told you, and all of a sudden the examiner says, thank you very much. Well, I haven't finished my speech. Once again, I would say that it's a blame which should squarely laid on the tutor. The tutor, it's a tutor's job, a teacher's job to teach students the format. That Pakistan has got one of the lowest average IELTS scores in the world. And it's about 5. About 5, you understand? About 5 minutes. And getting the idea, it's rather low. It's not a very good mark. The question is why? A little bit of different answers, which one would you like? Because students are stupid. Or maybe students don't study very hard, so they don't spend enough time. Or maybe it's because examiners are bad. Examiners are strict, examiners are unfriendly, they want to kill you, they want you to fail, they're sort of sitting there really wanting you to fail. Or maybe it's the questions which are difficult. Questions are difficult. It's a question which is difficult. I could say that, by the way, that in part 3, questions could be difficult. But otherwise, questions are just questions. You choose the way you want to answer them. And IELTS, of course, is a test which can be used to assess really low level students who can barely speak English and the really native students. So it's not a question of difficulty, it's a question of how you answer. That comes, of course, one important thing that schools, and you know that, those who study at school, but schools don't really teach you and don't prepare you for IELTS. Because the English which is taught at school is somewhat different from the language or from the performance you have to make for the IELTS. Because in IELTS, you have to be talking to an adult in a reasonable way. And schools, of course, make you memorize some funny stories about Lex. Remember that London is the capital of Great Britain. All this, and you just go and learn it by heart, which you of course never do in real life. But school is doing something which is very different to what IELTS requires. Very often you have parents, as we say, parents who want immediate results, parents who say you should go and do this course, you should study at Westminster University. And kids sometimes they don't want that. They just don't want that. They have to. And of course, if they're not motivated enough, they won't produce good results. And very importantly, we have candidates who misunderstand the purpose of the test. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So that you understand what IELTS is about. So you have to really understand what it is testing. And it's not testing stuff you memorize very hard. And very often we have candidates who are simply trained for the wrong type of test. So people who learn by heart, and they come and they need to communicate. So let's have a look at the typical problems in IELTS. I'm going to talk about different aspects of IELTS and different types of problems which have different aspects of the test, but also in different parts. So let's just remember what IELTS is. IELTS is a test. Part 1. What is it all about? Personal questions. Personal questions. Personal questions, and the topics are
Basic.
basic and new topics. So the personal questions very often starts with where you live, what you do, you study, so on, things like that. And then it goes into short phrase, called a phrase, when you have 4 questions in each phrase. And the phrases are not related to each other. Part 2.
Individual long term.
Individual long term. It's individual long term. You can say it's a monologue, it's a speech. As a candidate, you get a card, it's called a cue card, and it gives you a topic which you have to discuss. And you have 1 minute preparation time, and you can make notes, and you speak for 2 minutes. Uninterrupted, the examiner does this. No questions, nothing. So you just speak for 2 minutes. So the whole part is 4 minutes, and the last part is part 3. What is this part? Yeah. It's general questions. It's not personal any longer. It's more general, and it is connected to part 2. So this is important to remember that it is connected to part 2. And for example, if in part 2 you are asked to talk about a friend you haven't seen for ages, that you'd like to see again. In part 3, the topic would be, okay, let's talk about friendship. Then we'll do questions about whether friendship is possible, what age, whether girls and boys have different kind of friendship, etc. So that's the whole thing, and it lasts for 4 or 5 minutes. And in general, IELTS interview is about 13 to 14 minutes. And then you have criteria. So that performance, and you know the word performance, don't you? Performance is very important, because very often people come to IELTS and they think that the examiner judges them. examiner says, oh, you are good, you are bad. No, nothing like that. It's a performance which is assessed. If you are very good, you could be absolute genius, but you come and sit like this and say nothing, your performance will be 0 and you will get a 0. If you say a couple of words, if you start speaking like in short sentences, you can get a better one. But nobody cares really about how good you are. Everybody cares about your performance. So performance is assessed in 4 categories. So there are 4 criteria. One is fluency and coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, grammatical range of accuracy, and conversation. So we will talk about this a bit later. So let's look at the problems in fluency and coherence. So what sort of typical problems happen in this criteria? So when fluency coherence, what does it mean to be fluent and to be coherent as a speaker? I think what it has is to make sense, to talk something meaningful with a certain ease and elegance. You have to be easy about what you're doing. You have to make sense. You have to explain it. You have to analyze. You have to describe. But what happens very often is that, for example, candidates simply don't have to, simply have nothing to say about it. And that's why, as I said, it's sometimes tough for school children, because at school, you don't really have, most school children don't really have that world view, which is wide enough to assess lots of different things, which is important to pass through. But very often, people don't think and don't really have a feeling about it. So they can't formulate an idea or express it. And that, you can see that it's not related to English. It's very much the problem of a personality. And sometimes I would say, can you do that in your own language? You write a paper in your own language on that topic. People simply can't. What also brings down fluency coherence when people start speaking slowly, with pauses, and it is a bit like this. These pauses are frequent, there's no flow to the speech, that brings your fluency down. Or people can start speaking very slowly, unnaturally slowly, or they speak very fast. Both are quite bad. So if you speak very fast, you don't really make structured speech. If you speak very slowly, it's difficult to perceive. So that is both things in the context. Very often you have candidates who overuse certain cohesive devices, and they start the sentence with the same phrase, like, well, what kind of color do you like? Well, my favorite color is yellow. Where do you live? Well, I live in Angela. Or wow, or something like, you know. Okay, it's used. Sometimes it's all right. But if you overuse it, it also gives it's down. Don't do that. Don't use all these cohesive devices too often. And then people also create cliches, and they use cliches, and that can work in the sense where you ask, where do you live? And you say, well, to be honest with you, I live in Somalia. Thank you very much for your honest answer. Or, can you tell me your full name, please? Yeah, as you can probably guess, my name is Alisha. I can't guess. Not honest. And things like that, people learn these bits. they learn, to be honest with you, thank you for the question, but they don't use them at all. And that also brings security down. So if you do something like that, make sure you know how to. If you think about lexical resource of vocabulary, what is important here? So what is the objective of that assessment question? Is to see if people can use a wide range of words, but to the point. It's not just lots of funny or unusual words, but whether they can be used properly, which is different. So these two things is what lexical resource is all about. Using a wide range of words to the point. What people sometimes do, they want to avoid mistakes. They want to speak about mistakes. They say, okay, I will use only simple words, which can be used everywhere. Like good. The weather is good, the bottom is good, computer is good, screen is good, everything is good. No problem. But that, of course, means that your range is very narrow. If you use just those safe, easy words. The opposite strategy is when people start using very complex vocabulary, especially to impress the examiner. So they learn some very unusual words and they try to use them. And most often, it comes as a kind of, it's not a disaster, but very often low-level candidates can't do that properly. Because unusual words usually have special meanings. To give an example, we can say good about everything, everything can be good. But if you use the word gorgeous, which also means good, gorgeous, you can say gorgeous weather, you can say gorgeous girl, for example, but you can't say gorgeous water, or gorgeous computer, or a gorgeous flower. It's not gorgeous at all, right? It's flower. So, we have to this is it is frozen. This is just
and there was no without the presentation.
Yeah, we can continue without the presentation. I can read it here. I can talk. It's not what you talk. That's okay. Let's just forget about that. So I hope you hear me well enough. It's fundamentally involved with this system. Do you think it will stay like this? Sometimes it doesn't work. So we were talking about things like complex vocabulary. I gave you an example of the word gorgeous, which you can't use as freely as the word good. Or sometimes what happens, especially when people study language with the help of their first language. First language influences language you learn. And what happens very often, we have so-called false synonyms, right? People use the words from their own language and they think that they mean the same. The typical example here would be like жить. You know, the word жить in Russian, but you can translate it as a citizen when we talk about a person who lives in a certain country, and a dweller as a person who lives in a flat. They are not synonyms. We can't really say, I am a dweller in the place. And very often can do that, just because it's translated into Russian as shooting. Same thing is dishonest, unfair. People think, okay, честный. But dishonest means not saying the truth, not being truthful. Unfair means not being just. Честный. So unfair gain, and dishonest information. So again, because it's translated in Russian with one word, people very often confuse this, or they say something like solve and decide. I decided a task. I solved. I solved. But things like this happen very often. And then there's also misunderstood words. Like people don't understand things like holiday. And if the question is about what would you like to do on your next holiday? People say something like, okay, they think next holiday is going to be New Year or Navruz or something like that. So, okay, I'm going to my parents. Then they realize that no, holiday means in fact a big sport rather than price. So, things like that. Or do you work or are you a student? So, no, I'm not a student. What do? I study. I study IELTS. Well, because they think that student means studia. Student means a person who studies. So if you study IELTS, so you're a student as well. Things like celebrity, people think it's celebration. Then people ask like, do you play any games at home? The question is about cards or chess, but people think, oh, football. Science. It's not Nauka. Nauka is a much more broad term. But for example, you know what science, give me an example of science. Rocket science, math, biology, chemistry. Okay, physics. History, is it science? Literature?
It's art.
It's art, it's humanities, it's not science. And classical music, people often talk about classical music, but we want to talk about Shlomo Zurab. Shlomo Zurab is a great singer, but I would say that he's a traditional singer. Classical is more things like that, and but that also brings people down. And then again, I'd like to say that cliches are very often people memorize things, they don't use them properly. Is that day by day, or behind your breast on that often happens. And if it happens very often, it brings your mind down. Let's talk about grammar, grammatical range and accuracy. So I think that what you should do, you should try to show how you can use grammar to convey meaning. Grammar is not just about being right or wrong, making a mistake or not making a mistake. Grammar is about expressing yourself. And skillful use of grammar is the process where you can use grammar, can use grammatical rules in order to express certain ideas. It is not just having the right ending or having the right article. What happens very often, people overlook that. And then they go and use very short repetitive structures just to avoid mistakes. Especially in writing. I go there, I study there, I live here, I work. Okay, all these sentences are correct. There are no mistakes, but they do not show your range of vocabulary or range of grammatical. And then speaking is the same. Very often you have candidates whose level is relatively high, but then they make lots of very stupid elementary errors, like calling a mother and missing or confusing some kind of pronouns or conjunctions, or saying like he had. So if there are lots of errors like this, elementary errors, this also brings you down, although the language may be quite good in general. Somehow students find it difficult very often to deal with questions. What is the most important thing that you learned? Yes, I know. What is the most important thing that you learned? So tell me what have you learned? People say, yeah, yes. So they take it as a general question. The other thing is that, do you prefer tea or coffee? No. No what? No, coffee. No tea or no coffee. So the question is, do you prefer tea or coffee? It's called a disjunctive question. And it's not about yes or no. So very often have candidates struggling with this. Verbs and tenses, did you have in IELTS? So it's very fragile. It's fragile and alive. In IELTS, almost in every phrase, you have a question which starts with would. And it asks you to use imagination. Would you like to travel abroad? Would you buy a car? Would you move to a different city? It's not necessarily do you want to, but would you consider that? Imagine what it might happen. Again, very often candidates don't do that. They don't understand would, and they say, no, I don't travel to another country. I'm going to meet you there. Would you like to travel to a different country? No, I always live in Tashkent or in Samarkand. So would is a question of imagination, and it's always there. Complex subjects, complex objects. make a lot of small mistakes, but they're frequent. They also bring your grammatical range accuracy down. If they're even small and not important, but they're multiple. So let's have a look at the last criteria. Criterion is one. It's pronunciation. In this culture, in our culture, we have the idea that pronunciation is all about accents. Whether you've got a good accent, you've got a bad accent, British, American people are interested in accents. But basically, pronunciation is not just about accent, it's about how you use your voice, your sound, your vocal qualities of your sound to convey meaning and attitude. Because pronunciation is all about meaning and attitude. It's about more about intonation than about accent. So what happens is that people very often speak like this all the time. They don't use different languages. And of course, at the end of it, you want to go just it's a flat intonation, which is typical for languages like Russian. And English is not like that. English is full of falling tones, rising tones. It's much more alive. But people don't notice that, and they speak very often with a very flat intonation, which does not show any meaning or any energy. They speak like this all the time because they want to sound very positive. Rising tone, rising tone, rising tone. And again, it's a different way of being monotonous, but not dull, but rather upbeat, but still. So that ruins the pronunciation. Again, people very often use words which they have read, but don't know how to pronounce them. So here we have some typical examples, like lots of people say Moscow. What do? I go to Moscow to pray. How do you pronounce the word? Mosque. Right? Mosque. It's not Moscow, although it's Japanese. And then the second one is a really funny one. When you have girls or boys talking about their toys, and they say something like, my father, when I was young, my father bought me beer. And I put my beer, and I really liked my beer. And I took my beer with me to bed, and I played with my beer, and there's kind of this idea of a kid who's going with his kind of beer and just drinking quietly. And of course, it's bear. It's teddy bear. It's bear. So, like, lots of people pronounce it like vehicle or something like that. So lots of things happen like that. And my advice would like make sure if you want to use a word, and English is full of such words, just make sure you know how to pronounce. Then there are some words which are not exactly mispronounced or misheard, but rather misinterpreted. In IELTS, you have this question about culture. So the idea is that they want to know your position or what happens around you. But you may be like, for example, like in this room, maybe basically a Korean living in a Tajik-speaking city of Samarkand in a Uzbek-speaking country. Next. And you can say like, in your culture, how do people celebrate New Year? And you can choose, if you're Korean, you can talk about Korea, you may talk about how it's done in a Tajik context, in Uzbek context, you think about the ex-Soviet Union, right? So you decide which culture you belong to. It's not the same as country. Very often we have this question in IELTS, like in your culture, and people keep on thinking it's country. And they go off topic. Obviously, things like course and pause, leave and leave, mispronounced as well. In Russian, very often you have most typically the last consonant is softened. Like for example, if I say the word court, it can be called like code, or it can be court, like a cat. In English, it's code and cat. The sounds are clear, they're either voiced or not voiced. But Russian speakers often make this mistake and they talk about iPod size, dog, off, and instead of off. And when that, but for an English language speaker, these are kind of errors. So they don't receive it as normal softening of the word, but they think it's an error. They don't understand. They what? What do you say? Hot dog. I mean hot dog. So that happens, and Russian speakers often do that. With speakers, do this. They say, look it, watch it, student is. So they insert one vowel very often at the end. And in general, Uzbek doesn't really like too many consonants taken together. They want to break this with vowels. So that's typical. So students, it's not very comfortable to many speakers. And then we have also big girls who do this. Yes, I see. Yeah, not too well. So that's the where's the tone? Yeah. And my mother told me. Things like that. That's very funny, but when it becomes expected, and you speak like this all the time, it becomes intrusive. And really, it baffles the native speakers. So these things you have to really be careful about and think about that also because we sometimes don't notice such things, but listen to and more attentive to how you speak. Now, I want to say a couple of words about another thing which is very important. It's not a criteria. It's not a criterion for assessment. That's very important. I call it topic development, or how you talk, how you deliver your message across. So, in general, it can be said like whether you can really show with your speech that you can either work abroad or study in an English language context. So, the problems which can happen here is people have very narrow provincial worldview, so they know about their city, their family, and they know nothing about the world, or very little. And as soon as the question concerns something outside their immediate life, they can't really talk about it. That is a problem. To do that, they often rely on stereotypical answers. Who's your favorite old person you know and respect? Of course, the president. Who's your favorite sports person? Of course, Cristiano Ronaldo. Who's your favorite writers? Of course, Abdullah Qadiri. And of course, which is your favorite food? Is plov. Because people do this and they speak about such things all the time. But that brings this stereotypical answer and it sort of creates really, first of all, it's artificial, it's memorized. Second thing is, doesn't show your personality. It's not about your opinion, it's about what you think the examiners want to hear. But when you hear that everybody loves plov, every single person loves plov is my favorite. People, as I said, often for some strange reasons start talking about the government. The government is responsible for everything. They talk about national traditions. They talk about the president. Well, that's not really relevant to IELTS. So, two reasons concerned. It's about people. It's not about what the president thinks about it. And then I call it the great why question. People say something like, my favorite car is BMW. And I can say, why? And people say, really, how do I explain that? Why? Why do I like it? So that's brings you down, brings the whole conversation down. Because you can't really think about an explanation of some kind. If the question why stops you, freezes you, this shows that your ability to use English is limited to things you know, but you don't think. And it's very important to think in English. So a why question is important. And every single statement in IELTS can be accompanied by a why question. So then you can say, well, why? What sort of color do you like? My favorite color is green. Why? You have to think about it. Well, because it's a color of the grass, it calms me down, it makes me feel happy, so something. But it's important. Then personal opinion is important. So you don't talk about your personal opinion all the time, but you should have it. You can't really say, well, I haven't really thought about it. Well, you should think now why this is better than that, because that's what you really have to demonstrate. But we can have an opinion, we can have an attitude. Then in part 3 in particular, it is obvious that some candidates have very weak analytical skills. They are asked to compare, to contrast, to compare now with the past, to compare men with women, to compare older people with younger people, their tastes, their interests, their likes, dislikes, and give reasons why this may be so. Maybe generalize, saying that in general, in Uzbekistan, things like that, or focus on important issues. And that is something which is really tested in part 3. And again, I'm saying that for school kids, sometimes difficult because school doesn't require that. Very often schools don't want their students to think. They just give some kind of knowledge and they want students to reproduce this knowledge back. And that's not what IELTS is all about. So, let's now look at the stages of preparation to IELTS and errors which happen during the exam. So while preparing for IELTS, there are multiple errors which people make while learning English, while preparing for the exam. And very often is that they completely misunderstand the purpose of IELTS. And as I told you that you can think about it as what? Is it a police station? Is it interrogation? Is it a battlefield? Is it a sports achievement? No, I would say that it's a test. A test just gives you information. So you want to know how fat you are, you go and stand on a scale and it says you are 80 kilos. Or you go and check your height, you check your blood pressure, and your blood pressure is this. So that's what IELTS is about. It just tells you what you are. It's not high, it's not low, it's exactly, that's your level. So it's not a tragedy, it's not a drama. And many people so want to have a drama. They want to have kind of problem with this. Or they, as I said, that they may have a very narrow goal that I need to get to university. I need band 7, that's all. I don't need English at all. I need band 7 because my father wants me to study business. If that is the case, I think many people will find it hard to get a high mark. Because if you're not interested in the language, if you're not motivated, if you don't really care about English, right, you can only learn as much. You won't be able to learn a lot of many interesting analytic things. So in order to get a high mark, you should develop this interest. And again, we say that very often tutors teach some kind of artificial IELTS language to students. So they say, well, you have to use this, you have to do that. So that's English and that's IELTS. No, that's wrong. You use English, and IELTS is about how you can communicate in English as a normal person, an average person. talking about different topics. So it's not anything special, but that often happens. And you have situations like this. The candidate examiner asks, like, what kind of book did you like when you were young? Did you like when you were young? And the answer, like, wow, thank you for the question. To be honest with you, when I was knee-high grasshopper, and when our government was doing running day by day better, I wanted to tell you about how I studied very hard, and I want to be and it's a complete rubbish. But the candidate, of course, is sure that he or she is doing really well, so they use some complex vocabulary like ameliorate. They use phrasal construction, they use phrases. I was knee-high to grasshopper. They talk a lot. They talk fast, and they think, oh, I'm really answering this question well. No. So that's IELTS. It's not English. You have to use English. Let's now go through parts, and just keep in mind what happens in each part. And also just show you some typical errors which bring you down when you go through these parts. For example, errors in part 1. Greetings. How do you greet people when you enter the examination room? Do you say something? Normally, when you enter the room, then there is an examiner. You say hello. Good afternoon. Yeah, great. If you don't, that's okay, but it shows that you don't know how to communicate. When the examiner asks your full name, what does it mean? It's the first name and the surname, so it's not just Ansha, but. And when you say something like, my name is Muhammad Karim Zoda, but you call me my English name, which is Mr. Mike. That happens often and sounds awful. We don't do that. Don't create an English name, especially when it's sort of really unclear why. Okay, if you are a baboon, you can say no. You can call me Bob. That's fine. You're a John, you can say you can call me John. My English name is John. So now, be reasonable. If you have a really difficult name like Muhammad Karim Zoda, that's difficult to pronounce. You can say, but you can call me Karim. So be human. Don't create a funny name. Don't say like my name is Mr. Frank or something. And don't greet people like Mr. Surprisingly, lots of people struggle with the very first question about where you live. Where do you live? Which country? Which part of the country do you live? People say like, yeah, I live in Samarkand. Samarkand is a different country. And then they say something like, yeah, I live in Tashkent, and Shahrazad is a nice town. And then you're like, wow, what is that? So I hope you know what happens here. We will look at that later. We talked about that. What do you do? Do you work or are you students? So if you study anything noise. Then another thing we should remember that in part 1, frames or topics are structured in the same way. So it's a statement that starts with the phrase let's. So the examiner says, let's talk about clothes. It's not a question, it's a statement. Let's talk about clothes. Then comes the question, what kind of clothes do you wear as well? And people very often start answering the question without hearing the question. So let's talk about clothes. And say, yeah, clothes. Clothes is good. Clothes is good, and I like clothes, and I good man of clothes. Hold on. The question is, what kind of clothes do you wear as well? So this is a statement and then question. So it's always the same structure. Statement, 4 questions. Statement, 4 questions. So that should be remembered. And again, keep in mind some of these questions are disjunctive. So the or, either or. Do you like tea or coffee? Do you prefer something like black tea or green tea? And would you want to buy a car? Would you want to turn abroad? So these questions are always there. Topic remains the same, so statement, 4 questions about the same topic, but 2 frames in part 1. They're not related to each other. So here we have also do, did, have, will, use. Keep in mind that would you want, it's not about what you actually do, it's about your imaginary things which you might want to do. So let's just do this. I mean, very quickly. This example, where you live, city, country, region, town, province, village, state, and district. So, if I say Samarkand, what is Samarkand? It's a city. Uzbekistan?
Country.
It's a country. Or you can say a state, but state would probably be the Republic of Uzbekistan. State. Kazakhstan. It's a town, or it could also be a district. If it's the area, right? It's a district, rayon, tomorrow. Right? That's very often you hear people saying, "But where do you live?" I come from Samarkand. I come from Samarkand. From Samarkand, and what is your hometown? It's Kazakhstan. Do you come from Samarkand? Do you come from Kazakhstan? To me, Samarkand is a city. Kazakhstan is a town. But to many people, actually, Samarkand is the name of a province. When they say I come from Samarkand, they mean I come from the province of Samarkand. Or like people say I'm from Fergana. They don't mean the city, they mean the province or the valley. And that confuses people sometimes. You just really should think that. If you talk about the province, you just say Samarkand province. I mean, in a village in the Samarkand province. You don't say I live in Samarkand. Samarkand is a city. Central Asia is what? Uzbekistan is a country. Central Asia is a region. The region normally doesn't have borders, and we have in our passports Samarkand region. I think this is a mistake. It should be Samarkand province. It's obvious, it's province. In English, it's province. Region is a kind of area around something. Bagishamo is what? Street. We have it. Bagishamo street. This is a district. This is a district. A district. And Jambai is. You can say Jambai, it could be a district if you say Jambai district. But it's a town, used to could be a village many years ago. But please keep in mind this. And what is the countryside? Do you like spending time in the countryside? It's outside. It's not in a different country. It has nothing to do with country. It's a village, it's a rural area. So that is problematic sometimes. Okay, let's look at errors in part 2. Do you remember part 2? Yeah. You get a card. So what happens? The examiner says something, okay, now I would like you to talk about this topic, and you can make some notes. And here's paper and pencil. So examiners have paper and pencil. You don't have to have that. And the examiner gives you a topic. So there's no need to ask, oh, can I have a pencil? Can I have a paper? No, of course you can, but the examiner will give it to you. And the preparation minute starts as soon as the examiner says, I want you to talk about friends you haven't seen for a long time and you would like to see again. That's it. As soon as the examiner says, stop talking, that's the preparation minutes are. And sometimes candidates sort of sit there and they start. Yes, of course. The minute is already going. So that's the preparation. Sometimes students don't use this preparation unit well. They either don't read the task, and I think that it's important. You read the task, you try to understand what it means, what it says, so that you don't make mistakes. And then you think about how you would answer. Then you can write. Many people just grab the pencil and they start writing. Or they write like my favorite food is, and then the minute stops. So don't use this minute for preparation wisely. Think more than write. Why? Because you can make a wrong choice of topic. Sometimes people talk about, I want you to talk about a sports person you enjoy. And you choose, okay, I'm going to talk about, let's say, Cristiano Ronaldo. And I say, my favorite football player is Cristiano Ronaldo, I love him, and he was born in, he's Brazilian, and so on. So people really, again, you might like Cristiano Ronaldo, but you should be able to talk about him for 2 minutes. Okay? He's a nice kid, he's a great sportsman, but it's not enough. You have to be able to talk about this person. So what he likes, where he was born. If you know that, that's good. But if you just choose to talk about him and you don't have information, then it's a disaster. Or, for example, people start talking about something they don't have vocabulary for. Like, I want to describe the work of one of your relatives. And they start talking about grandfather who was an engineer in a metal construction plant. And to describe what he was doing would be very difficult in Russian or in English, let alone English. You have to really understand what he was doing as an engineer in a metal construction plant. So things like that happen, and people sometimes start writing without thinking, how am I going to answer this question? That happens very often. Then, when the long term ends, the examiner stops you and says, thank you very much. Can I have the paper and pencil back? And the idea is simple. The examiner gives you a booklet, a paper and pencil, and wants it back. Or booklet, and sometimes you can say, pencil? Yes, pencil. Paper? Yes, and paper. Everything, give me back. So you receive it, you just give it back. And then there's a short slot for so-called round-up questions. And it's just 20 seconds for that. And have you ever seen this person live? Or is your grandfather still working there? So it's not an invitation for a long talk. Just a short question, short answer. Yes, my grandfather is still working there. Oh no, it's died. Things like that. So it should be very short. Now, the last bit is, of course, part 3. Now, errors in part 3. That's where difficult part starts. And I think I mentioned it already, but I will say that in part 3, the examiner asks sometimes questions which make the candidates struggle, just to see where this point is, where you stop being confident, you stop being really good, and you start sort of maybe having problems. So with say part 1 and 2, everybody who's above 6 can do pretty well. In part 3, that's where you distinguish between band 7, band 8, band 9. Those can be quite difficult, but anyway, what happens in part 3? You should remember that it's not about you any longer. Part 1 is about you. Part 2 is also about you. Tell me about your friend, tell me about the trip you'd like to make. Part 3, stop talking about yourself. You have to now talk about general issues, general questions related to part 2, but no more about yourself. And that's where many candidates struggle. They say something, okay, let's talk about people in your country. do people in your country eat a lot of meat? You say, yes, yes, for example, and they go back to talking about it. Don't do that. Keep in mind that in part 3, examiners can have some freedom. In part 1 and 2, we just read out stuff which is there, and they don't really invent any questions. In part 3, they make questions slightly easier, slightly more difficult. And it's usually 2 frames, frame 1, 2, 3, but only 2 are used. And the number of questions in part 3 is between 6 and 8. And it's not like part 1 where you really have questions answered, especially in part 3, you really try to make a conversation, try to make a discussion where 2 people are talking. The more it resembles an actual discussion, the better. But here, what happens is that many candidates simply cannot generate ideas, they don't have anything to say, they have no ideas, they can't generalize, they talk just about what they know. And they can't make comparisons, they can't make projections, and they find it difficult. And it's, again, as I'm saying, it's not about ranking as such, it's about thinking. Because very often, especially young people, they don't they're not taught to do that at school. School gives you knowledge and it takes it back. You learn your history, then you go to the history class and they say, 1942, So in IELTS, it's not like that. In IELTS, what's your reaction, your opinion, your position? As I said, young people especially struggle. So the only way to go around it is to improve your thinking. And that's why people very often start talking about theoretical answers or memorized answers, which doesn't really work. That's the worst. When people say, I never thought about it, and I always say, want to say that, okay, you have a chance now. Would you like to travel abroad? I never thought about it. Think about it now. You want to travel. Why are you learning English? And the last thing which I would like to offer you is a kind of checklist which you want to ask yourself when you are preparing for IELTS. And you think, really, what is IELTS for you? Why do you need it? And if it's just a ticket to a better world, okay, you have to be honest about that. But keep in mind that it's very unlikely you can reach a very high level if you just want IELTS because you want to get a role. You really need to develop an interest in the English language. Are you struggling with IELTS? I would say that if you're struggling with IELTS, then you don't take it. As simple as that. We talked about that earlier. Why in Uzbekistan we have a really low level of average IELTS score? Not because people are stupid, because lots of people go into being unprepared. It's like soldiers who are not trained, they go and fight and they die. And that's what the tutors should do. They can't really let weak students go and take IELTS. You just go and take IELTS when you're ready. And you just don't go there. And if the person whose level is band 4 comes and takes IELTS, it's suffering. They don't understand questions. They don't understand what it's all about. They can't say anything really reasonable. And examiners. So basically, if you're struggling with IELTS, don't take it. Reach the level where you're not struggling, and then take it. So this question: do you like English? If you do, then you have a hope of reaching the high level. If you don't, you may reach, I hate it, but I need to take an exam. Well, you can do that, but then it's unlikely you're ever going to be really high level. Very often when people want to take IELTS, they simply go and study IELTS as if it were a subject. IELTS is not a subject. IELTS is an exam. You really need to know the format. You really need to know what is happening, but it is not a subject. Subject you're studying is English, and you have to absolutely listen, write in English outside the IELTS classroom. So it's not enough just to study IELTS textbook. You absolutely have to have a much wider context. And then things which I think are important. If you learn IELTS, if you understand how it works, do you work on yourself? Do you get something new? Are you getting better as a person? Do you kind of expand your mental horizon? That's what should be happening. And that's very gratifying when you do that, when you study IELTS. And basically, that's what the purpose is. If you don't do that, if you just study it very formally, then probably you're on the wrong track. So, then basically, I would say this as a kind of my final recommendation. So you study English, don't study IELTS. Use official materials, don't use some strange, reliable tutors who've been properly trained. If there's any doubt, ask the British Council. They have a helpline, they have special people trained to give you answers like a normal person. Normal person, that's important. Okay, so thank you very much. Do you have any questions? If you have any questions, so let's just see. If anything.
What differences between 8-band and 9-band score?
I think I've answered it in every single session today. Now I can do it much better than the first time. I think that's a 9 is what we call educated native speaker level. That's not perfect. But what happens at 9, a person can speak or write easily about a wide range of things, not everything. At 8, people will still kind of maybe struggling with certain things. I mean, they can do it well. They can also talk about a wide range of topics, but then there could be some kind of unease or struggling with certain phrases. And at 9, that's elegance is important. So the way you express yourself with elegance, ease, and just kind of smoothly and without any interruption. With 8, you can still be like a little bit like a schoolboy. Answering the questions, getting all the answers right, but not that sort of arrogant.
I have a question. You were probably right when mentioning about the law schools in Uzbekistan. As you know, that a lot of students or candidates are not able to take IELTS, on the score. Probably 7, 7.5, and then, very few of them are able to take higher levels. And due to the fact that the whole system of Uzbekistan is already low, like lack of professionals at schools, lyceums, universities, I would say. And the question is, I would like to tell you that candidates suffer from not only the lack of reliable courses, but also the difficulties in IELTS materials for those who finish secondary schools. Like, sometimes they really tell us about that problem and how could we solve this problem, because it is a British concept.
Yes.
It's a kingdom of Great Britain, and there is nothing to do to tell them, right? To dictate that. So it's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely right. This, I think the problem here is that schools
Yeah.
very often have lots of people who are like 16 years old. They go to, from a school bench to IELTS, and that's a big gap. It's a huge gap. The schools don't teach children to think. They don't. It's not only about English. It's about independent thinking, about critical thinking, about how you express your opinion in whatever language. And people sometimes say, Alex, why don't we get like high scores in writing? I say, okay, will you be able to write a good paper about the role of women for the, let's say, the welfare of the country in your language, whatever, Uzbek, Tajik, Russian? And people say, of course, it's difficult, because in this culture, in our culture, we don't really teach people how to express their ideas. But that's what they're expected to do when they come to Britain. And that's why I think very often you have lots of people who are okay, they have some English, but then when they come to IELTS, they are required to do things they're not ready for. So it's like, again, like school kids going to fight in the army. Okay? You have to be properly trained, you have to think, you have to be, okay. So it's not enough just to have some grammar and vocabulary. You have to be really, should I say, a mature person to do well.